These are the lecture notes for chapter 39, the respiratory system. Okay, there we go. All right, the primary function of the respiratory system is for gas exchange, and the gases that we're talking about are oxygen and carbon dioxide. So all of our cells require oxygen for cellular respiration. We learned that in Bio 111. So oxygen is needed to break down glucose into to produce ATP by the breakdown of glucose. That is cellular respiration. But we produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct of that, and carbon dioxide, when it builds up in our tissues or in our cells, is toxic. So the exchange of gases is going to be taking in, so oxygen in, and then getting rid of the carbon dioxide out. In vertebrates, gas exchange occurs between the alveoli, which are the air sacs in the lungs, and the blood capillaries. So this is this occurs by diffusion because the cells that form the alveoli and the blood capillaries are very flat. It's only a single layer of cells. I don't know if you remember, but it's simple squamous tissue, simple squamous epithelial tissue, which is a single layer of flat cells. And that is what forms the air sacs in the lungs and the blood capillaries. So it's very easy for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse across that tissue. So in the alveoli, of course, because you just breathed in, you just inhaled, you have a high concentration of oxygen. That drives the diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli to the blood. And then in your blood, since you've built up carbon dioxide in your tissues through cellular respiration, you have a high concentration of CO2 in your blood. So at the same time you're diffusing oxygen from your air sacs into your blood, you're diffusing carbon dioxide from the blood into your air sacs or your alveoli. And in the tissue, the opposite occurs. So in the tissue, let's just say this is a tissue cell. Here's your nucleus. And then this is a flat squamous cell of your blood capillary. Here's the nucleus of that. Your capillaries are from your blood. Okay, so, all right. So CO2 has built up in your tissue cells, and oxygen has been carried in from your blood to your cells. The oxygen is going to diffuse into your tissue cells, and the CO2 is going to diffuse into your blood. And so that's what happens in the tissue is oxygen from the blood diffuses into the tissue cells, and CO2 from the tissue cells diffuses into the blood, where it eventually arrives in the lungs and you breathe it out. Okay, the rate of diffusion between two regions, say the capillaries and the alveoli or the capillaries and the tissue cells, is governed by Fick's law of diffusion. So this has got some math in here, even though this is biology. Sometimes we do math in biology. R equals the rate of diffusion. So it equals how fast the diffusion is going to occur. And it is controlled by a diffusion constant. So that doesn't change, just a number. A, which is the area over which diffusion takes place. So the greater that area, the faster the rate of diffusion. The change in pressure, the pressure difference between the two sides. So the higher the difference, like if this is your alveoli, and this is your capillary, and you have like say 90% oxygen in your alveoli, and in the capillary you have say 40%. So you've got a difference in 50%. Oxygen is going to diffuse at a certain rate, but if the difference was greater, say it was 90% in the alveoli and 20% in the capillary, then the diffusion rate is going to be even greater. It's going to diffuse even faster. So the greater and I said percent difference, which tends to equal the pressure, or tends to correspond with the pressure difference. So the greater that pressure difference between the two sides, the faster the diffusion rate. And then the distance over which diffusion occurs, that one is an opposite effect. The smaller that distance, the faster the diffusion rate. So the closer together the air sac is and the blood capillary, then the faster the diffusion is going to occur. Okay. Evolutionary changes have occurred to optimize the rate of diffusion. This can be done, like I just said it out loud, but now you have it in your notes. If the surface area is increased, if the distance is decreased, or if the pressure or concentration difference is increased. So basically in your formula, the two variables that are on the top of the formula, if they're increased, the diffusion rate increases. And then the variable on the bottom, distance, if that is decreased, then the diffusion rate is increased. So unicellular organisms are different because they're made of one cell. So gases just diffuse directly into unicellular organisms. But multicellular organisms require a body system, a respiratory system. And amphibians, frogs, salamanders, use their skin and their lungs. That is why their skin needs to be kept moist, not constantly in a frog or a toad, but we know that frogs and toads live in water and on the land, and so they're going to be able to breathe better when their skin is moist, because gas exchange requires a moist surface. Lungs are already moist, but the skin has to be moist by water. Insects have a tracheal system, whereas humans have one trachea, insects have many. Fish use their gills, and mammals have a large surface area because they have many millions of air sacs in their lung tissue. And the more air sacs you have, the more surface area that you have. Gills in fish increase the surface area for diffusion by the way that they are designed. And you can see here that oxygen-rich blood coming into the gills is going to flow in one direction, and it's going to drop off its oxygen so that it's oxygen poor when it leaves the surface of the gills. And then the water is going to flow in an opposite direction as the blood. That is called countercurrent flow. And that allows for the maximum amount of oxygen to be extracted. All right, so lungs replace gills in terrestrial animals. And the lungs are covered in mucus to prevent direct contact of lung tissue with air. So it's a protective mechanism. The lungs, the airways of the lungs are divided. Well, first of all, you have the throat, which is the pharynx, which is up here, which is the pathway for food, drink, and air. And air passes into the larynx, which contains your voice box, and then into your trachea or your windpipe. Your trachea branches to the right and the left. This is the right side. This is the left side, as if you're looking down on someone, like someone who's lying on a table and you're looking down on them. The right and left side are supplied by the primary bronchi, and then the primary bronchi branch into secondary bronchi. One of your lungs has 3 lobes and one has 2 lobes, so the secondary bronchi serve each lobe of the lung. And then the bronchi end up branching into bronchioles, which meet up or which have air sacs attached to their ends. Air pressure tends to be measured either in atmospheres or millimeters of mercury. So 760 millimeters of mercury or 1 atmosphere of air pressure are equal to each other. And the partial pressure of a gas is the pressure contributed by that gas to the total atmospheric pressure. So since oxygen is close to 20% of the gases in the air, it's going to exert a partial pressure of around 20% of that 760. Nitrogen is 79%, so it's going to exert a partial pressure of 79% of 760, which is 600.6 millimeters of mercury. Oxygen is going to exert about 21%, so that translates to 159.2 millimeters of mercury. And carbon dioxide is much lower. It's going to exert a partial pressure of 0.03%, which is 0.2, not even 1 millimeter of mercury. Higher up, at Base Camp 1 on Mount Everest, you are at 5,364 meters or 17,598 feet up above sea level. So the atmospheric pressure is quite a bit lower. It's lower the higher up you go. And so the partial pressure of oxygen is going to be lower. It's going to be 84 as compared to about 160. It's almost half as low. So it's really hard to breathe up there, and it's really hard to get enough oxygen up there. So that's why a lot of climbers use supplemental oxygen. Lungs in birds have a unidirectional flow, and you can watch the video. You can go back to the slides and watch the video on your own. But the lungs have a unidirectional flow. In other words, air is going to enter the trachea and the anterior and posterior, the lungs, and then the anterior and posterior air sacs. And then from there, in these air sacs, the oxygen will enter into the blood, and the carbon dioxide will leave the blood and enter the air sacs. Mammalian lungs contain millions of alveoli. That increases the surface area the more alveoli that you have. You can see here, this is a terminal bronchiole, which is what the alveoli are attached to. And alveoli are kind of grouped. They almost look like a cluster of grapes. Many alveoli in a little cluster, like a cluster of grapes. And you can see the capillaries are wrapped around each alveolus, and oxygen is going to leave the alveolus and enter the blood, and carbon dioxide will leave the blood and enter the alveolus. And this is just a blow up of alveoli and alveolar sacs. The alveolar duct, one duct leads to each sac. All right. The lining of the lungs is called the pleura, which is a serous membrane. It's a type of serous membrane. So it's a very thin membrane that has 2 layers, one layer that touches the lungs called the visceral pleura, and then one layer that lies against the chest cavity wall called the parietal pleura. So in the next section, we'll talk about inhaling and exhaling.